Yes.
I had the opportunity to teach a class here at Hope this past spring called Encounter with Cultures that's focused on cultural and racial diversity. And one thing that I struggled in teaching my students was the concept of implicit bias and unconscious racism.
Yes.
How do we bring those kind of themes to the surface? Because it's easy to focus on some of the examples that you gave us, the very, very blatant examples of racism and bias. But I really struggle with trying to help them understand how some of these thoughts and feelings are really ingrained in us. And I was just wondering if you had any strategies that I can use and that all of us can use to sort of recognize that, address it, change those things.
Well, thank you for your question. I do have some ideas, and let me begin by saying that I spent a long time teaching a course on the psychology of racism as a professor before I became a college administrator. I taught that course probably for 20 years and learned a lot about the difficulty many students have in absorbing information which runs counter to their beliefs about themselves, their families. You know, many young people grow up in a society with the idea that we live in a meritocracy. And to learn about systemic racism contradicts that idea at a very fundamental level. And the idea that many people think of themselves as without prejudice. In fact, how many of you have heard someone say, "There's not a prejudice bone in my body"? When I hear that, I'm always tempted to say, check again. The reality is not that people are prejudiced because they want to be or because they're bad people, but how can we not be when we're constantly bombarded with stereotypical images and negative messages about marginalized groups in our society? It's like breathing smog. No one wants to describe themselves as smog breathers, and I can't speak for the air quality in Holland, Michigan, but there are lots of places where if you get up in the morning, you're breathing smog, and whether you want to or not, because it's the only air that's available. And that is the reality when we think about the pervasiveness of the jokes we hear and the language people use and the assumptions people make, or even the nonverbal signals. You know, I used to do workshops with my close colleague and friend, Reverend Andrea Avazian, who is a white woman, and she grew up in upstate New York, and she used to tell the story of traveling from upstate New York to visit her grandparents in New Jersey, and before they built the thruway, they had to pass through a section of Harlem, and you know, her parents didn't say, "Oh, now we're in a dangerous part of town," but she would hear the doors lock and the windows go up, right? And so, you know, those nonverbal signals that are part of our socialization, all of us have that. And it is hard sometimes to recognize it and name it. But what I found helpful was activities like showing videos. There's some wonderful videos where other people are talking about their unconscious assumptions. And sometimes when you see somebody else naming it for themselves, you can say, well, gosh, I had that experience. I grew up, I had that, I felt like that. And sort of through that kind of vicarious learning, you can start to recognize that. But I also found, you didn't ask this question, but one of the things I found was that white students really struggled with the concept of privilege. You know, the idea that, what do you mean I have privilege? I don't have any privilege. You know, my life is hard. What privilege do I have? And then reading an article like Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Knapsack of Privilege. For those of you not familiar with it, she talks about things like, you know, I can go into any drugstore in any part of the nation and find skincare or hair care products that are going to work for me. You know, I can drive through a neighborhood that's unfamiliar to me and not worry that I'm going to be viewed by police suspiciously. I can, you know, she gives many examples. I can send my kids to school knowing that they're going to see themselves reflected in the textbooks. Those are things that we take for granted if we have them, but do not take for granted if we don't have access to them. And I found that asking students, for example, to go out and observe other people, to visit places, like to go to a mall where you're likely to see a racially mixed group of people, and to just sit and watch, who gets waited on, who gets followed in the store, those kinds of things, as an observer, kind of like an anthropologist, raised their awareness about things that they would not ordinarily have noticed. But it is, and so I'm going on a little bit too long in response to your question, I'm sure, but what I want to say is, courses like that are so important, and conversations like this are so important, but one of the things that's better about a course like that than a conversation like this is that it repeats itself with some regularity, right? You can come to a talk once a year or every 2 years and get some ideas and feel charged up, but unless you have some ongoing conversation, ongoing dialogue, it's easy to let that momentum slip away. One of the things that I found in my 20 years of teaching was that if you talk about race long enough, people will get uncomfortable. And if they weren't uncomfortable at the beginning, by the middle they're uncomfortable. Sooner or later they're going to get uncomfortable, and sooner or later they're going to say, you know what, I'm busy tonight. I don't think I'll go to that talk. But the reality is, unless you stick with it, you don't make progress. If you persist through the discomfort, you do see progress. If you persist through the discomfort, you not only see progress with other people, you see progress with yourself. And the reality is that is quite energizing. I found that my courses on racism, of all the things that I taught, were the most popular at the end, but most miserable in the middle. Because the reality is it does generate a lot of discomfort, and you have to work through that. But it's like having an ear infection. How many of you have had children with ear infections in your life? Or maybe you've had one yourself. And you know that if you've got a kid with an ear infection, they're going to give you that pink medicine, right, that the kid is supposed to take. And what do they tell you? Use it all, right? It's a 2-week dose or whatever. You have to take it for the whole 2 weeks. But the reality is the child doesn't like the taste and fusses about it and blah, blah. And if you take it for 2, 3, 4 days, the ear infection has gone away. It doesn't hurt anymore. And so there's a temptation to stop giving the medicine, though, of course, conscientious parents will give the whole thing. But having dialogue about racism is kind of like that. If you don't take the whole dose, it's kind of like not taking all of the pink medicine. If you don't take it all, what will happen? It comes back. The ear infection comes back. And not only does it come back, it comes back worse, right? It comes back worse, and next time, the pink medicine may not work. They may have to, you get a resistant form of the ear infection, and the antibiotic doesn't work so well. And so in the same way, if we don't make a commitment to persist past the discomfort, what you find is you raise people's anxiety, you don't allow them to do the hard work that brings that anxiety to a different place, a place of better resolution and encouragement to move forward, and they get stuck. And the attitudes that were under the surface may now be more conscious and in some ways more virulent. And so you have to really make a commitment for the long haul. So if I had one piece of advice to give to this community, don't do this just once every couple of years. Do it more frequently and make a commitment for ongoing dialogue, because it is in the long haul, through the ongoing, I disagree with what you said, I didn't like what you said, I was offended by that, let me come back next week and tell you how I feel about it today. It's that ongoing conversation that really brings about the change.
Thank you.
Thank you.